Hey, SnoozeLetter here, and I'm back with a new brush pack, and this one is quite huge. It's the Rough Pack 2 and it's following up on the previous Rough Pack, so I mainly focused on textures, especially on dry marker textures, paintbrush textures and nylon brush textures this time. In this video I want to give you a quick overview and walkthrough on the brushes and share some tips and tricks. I included a comprehensive guide on these brushes with a short explanation and some tips. The brushes are all numbered, so you can easily find them in the document. All in all, this pack contains 83 brushes, as well as worksheets on 5 different styles. The already mentioned guide on the brushes. I also threw in some basic grids, just to get you started. I also included 9 high-res backgrounds, to get you the most realistic looks with these brushes. And last but not least, I put in 5 different color palettes. Yeah, enough about the overview, let's talk about the brushes. I sorted the brushes into 6 different categories. You got your paint brushes, your chisel tip brushes, round tip brushes, felt and brush tips, wooling tips, and at the end we have the extra brushes. They are all exported into separate brush sets, so you have a better overview, since this is quite a lot. The first brush we are going to talk about is the paint stroke. This brush has a broad tip and comes with a fine and dry texture. And the best part, you can control the texture with your pressure you're applying to your Apple Pencil. This principle actually applies to most of the brushes in this pack. I personally found that the texture of usual Procreate brushes were a bit random and hard to control, which made it hard to work with. But this gives you the possibility to make it look like how you want it and to have full control over the texture. The second brush in this paint set is building up on the previous brush and is called Paint Stroke Follow. The shape and texture are following your movements, creating this paint stroke-like look. And as already mentioned, you can control the texture with your pressure for this brush as well. Next up we have the Paint Stroke Full. This one is inspired by a paintbrush with just some decent texture. The next brush is easily one of my favorites of this whole pack. The Paint Roller, inspired by a paint roller, and this brush is quite unique and it is introducing a new feature of this pack. This brush has 3 stages of texture that you can control with your pressure. Applying light to no pressure, you get this paint jitter-like effect, while going up with the pressure, the brush gets a more full stroke-like look, and in the end, applying hard pressure, you get those classic paint lanes. Skipping some brushes, next we have the Paint Roller Pressure. This one is building up on the previous shown brush and it varies in the size with your pressure. And I think I don't have to mention that the texture is changing with your pressure as well. Enough with the Paint Roller brushes. The next one is called Paint Full Pressure and has a slight wet paint look to it. And building up on this idea, we have the Paint Full Follow. The shape and textures are following your movements, creating this round paintbrush look. Skipping some brushes, we have a brush called Paintbrush with a slight texture and a wet look, which can add some additional depth to your strokes. And for the last 2 brushes of this paintbrush set, we have a group called Paint Hard. The speciality of this brush is when you apply less pressure at the end of the stroke, you will get this dry fading out paint-like effect. And that's it with the paint brushes. Let's move on to the chisel brush set. The first brush is called Chisel Dry and is imitating a dry chisel-like texture. You can control the texture with your pressure as well. More pressure equals more texture. Next up we have the Chisel Dry Pressure, which is building up on the previous brush with some additional pressure sensitivity for the size. Another brush in this group is called Chisel Dry Follow, and the shape and texture are following your movements, giving you this rounded kind of look, and the texture is also pressure sensitive. The next one is called Chisel Fine, It has a more detailed and fine texture, and you can also control the texture with your pressure. Following up on that, the Chisel Fine pressure with an additional pressure sensitivity for this size. And to complete this group, the Chisel Fine Follow with the shape and texture following your movements, creating this rounded-like shape. Skipping a lot of brushes, I'm going to show you the Chisel Edge. This one is quite funky. You will get an outline look if you apply enough pressure, and a full stroke with applying light pressure. Next up we have the Chisel Text. Got this rough texture, and you can control the texture with your pressure as well. More pressure equals less texture in this case. And building up on that, the Chisel Text pressure with some additional pressure sensitivity settings, giving you this nice rough brush look. For the last brush I'm going to show you of this Chisel Brush set is the Chisel Raw. Looks a little bit like a ruling pen kind of brush with an interesting shape. Moving on with the round tip brushes. The first brush of this set is the Round Raw. That is a squeezer inspired brush with a raw texture to it. While applying light pressure you will get more of a wet look, and while going up with the pressure you get a harder texture. You can use this by applying light pressure at the end of the stroke to get this dry fading out effect. Next up we have the Raw Full. It is building up on the previous shown brush, but has less texture to it and more of this wet paint look, which you also can control with your pressure. The next brush is called Round Text, and this has a really hard and dry texture that you can control with your pressure. And to close this group we have the Round Text Faded. The stroke is fading while applying less pressure, which allows you to make the strokes look like they were on top of each other. And skipping to the end of the round tip brushes, I will show you the Round Gravel. While applying more pressure it gets this weird rough texture. Moving on to our next brush set, the Felt and Brush Tip brushes. Skipping a few brushes in the beginning, we have the Felt Tip Rough brush. This one is inspired by the rough texture you get while using a nylon brush pen. And of course, the more pressure you apply, the more texture you get. Building up on that comes the Felt Tip Tex Hard, quite similar to the previous one, with a hard and sharp texture. Brush from the Felt and Brush set I'm going to show you is the Felt Tip Faded, with a quite unique texture that reacts to the pressure. The next brush set I'm going to show you are the Ruling Tip brushes, and kicking this set off is the Ruling Text. The brush has a quite classic folded pen-like texture, with the, how I like to call it, typical outbreak of the ink kind of shape. Skipping a few brushes we have the Ruling Hard, inspired by this folding pen jitter effect, which also reacts to the pressure. The next brush is the Ruling Dirty, and this ruling pen-like brush has this typical jitter with some paint splatters. And following this paint splatter idea, I made 3 additional brushes building up on this. And the first one of those is the Ruling Splatter with some bigger ink splatters. And the next one is called Splatter Fine with some finer ink splatters and a more sharp jitter-like look. And the last brush of the ruling pen-like brushes is the Splatter Hard with some more wider splatter. And last but not least we got the extra brushes. And first the Schlummerpinsel version 4. This time with a more rougher look to go along with the other brushes. I also added 2 drip brushes, the first one the Drip Short and the Drip Long with a kind of spray effect at the top, and the Spaz brush. I also added 8 additional splatter and sprinkle brushes just to spice up the work a little bit more and to have a broad variety to choose from and not have to use the same ones every time. And that is already it with the walkthrough. I hope you could get a deeper insight in this pack, and let me know if you have any questions left. You can click the link in the description to check it out on my shop. Yeah, thanks for your attention and have a good one.